I just finished reading Republic Lost by Lawrence Lessig.
Is that another one of those sun-baked Californian barefoot granola-munching neo-socialist invectives against the established order?
Not really. Actually, at one point he even restates an argument of F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom.
Hayek? Now I'm listening.
Good, because this is important. Lessig's book is about how money corrupts Congress. In fact, that's the subtitle.
Now I'm listening less.
Do you really think the most successful businesswomen in this country would spend hundreds of millions of dollars in political donations if they didn't think it would be good for their businesses?
Of course not. I just think the things that are good for businesses are good for the country as a whole.
Ah, you're in the Charles Wilson school of, what's good for General Motors is good for America.
That's actually a terrible misquote promulgated by Wilson's political opponents. But, regardless of its veracity, I largely agree with its sentiment. Businesses provide jobs. If businesses can operate in a fecund marketplace, they can provide more jobs and produce more goods. Besides that, the vast majority of congressmen are trained as lawyers, not as geological engineers or entrepreneurs. Frankly, they wouldn't even know how to legislate large businesses, or when not to, if they weren't receiving guidance from the businesses themselves.
Please, allow me to trace out Lessig's argument in a bit more detail before you're ensorcelled by the suffocating embrace of the status quo.
Okay, but only because I thought your metaphor was cute.
Lessig begins with the premise that Congress is meant to be dependent on its voters. James Madison pointed out, in Federalist 52, that Congress was meant to be that branch of the federal government which ought to be dependent on the people alone. Throughout the book, Lessig provides evidence that Congress is now dependent not on its constituents, but on an informal economy of favors provided to and from lobbyists and big businesses. For example, when Congresswoman Wyatt has an opportunity to vote for a bill that would enforce stricter pollution standards, she might realize that Mary, a lobbyist for the mining industry, is well connected with wealthy potential contributors. If Wyatt votes against the bill, Mary will be more likely to organize a fundraising dinner on her behalf. If she votes for the bill, Mary is much less likely to do anything that might help her win re-election. The important thing to note here is that Mary never says, "Vote against this bill and we will give your campaign money." Such quid pro quo arrangements are blatantly illegal. It never needs to be said. It just happens in the informal economy of favors.
I follow your logic, but I feel obliged to point out that lobbyists and corporations are not separate from a congressman's constituency, but are actually a part thereof.
And I feel obliged to point out that reality disagrees with you. There are no laws requiring politicians to raise money from exclusively within their constituencies. For an example, let's look at Representative Mike Simpson from Idaho.
Why him?
Well, I felt like I should pick someone at random, but I didn't want to actually try to number congresspersons and run a random number generator, so I looked at a map of the US and picked the state I think of least often, then rolled a die to pick the representative.
There's something counterintuitive about thinking that much about choosing at random.
It's hard to be me. Anyway, Representative Simpson's campaign committee raised $2.5 million in the 2013-2014 campaign cycle. His top contributor was General Atomics, a military defense contractor based out of San Diego with offices in Berlin, Dresden, Adelaide, Washington, D.C., Denver, Los Alamos, Oklahoma City, Tupelo, and Ogden. Can we really assume that the interests of the executives of General Atomics in San Diego are the same as the constituents of Representative Simpson in Idaho?
Point taken. Please, continue.
Lessig's book is replete with examples of mutually beneficial relationships like that between Mary and Wyatt. I think my favorite is Lessig's description of how the government uses, or doesn't use, its market power. When running for president in 2008, then-Senator Obama excoriated the provision of Medicare Part D that prevented the government from directly negotiating for lower prescription drug prices because it caused the program to cost an extra $16 billion per year. Naturally, he campaigned on including a strong public option in his healthcare plan which would be able to directly negotiate the costs of services with healthcare providers. The Congressional Budget Office reported that this provision could save $10 billion per year, but it was ultimately not included in the bill, even though 70% of the population supported it. So, which conclusion is more reasonable? That the Democratic establishment suddenly realized the inclusion of the public option was so terrible that it was worth reneging on a campaign promise and opposing an idea the public supported? Or that congresswomen were so dependent on the network of lobbyists with ties to the insurance and healthcare industries that they felt like it was imprudent to oppose them?
Or, perhaps, they were always concerned about government monopoly, and they were disingenuous during their campaigns in order to appeal to the 70% of voters who supported a public option.
Whatever the case, The potential influence of the lobbyists in the healthcare industry can easily be viewed as suspicious, right?
The potential corruption you've identified is logically sound, though empirically unproven.
Well, it doesn't need to be proven for us to care. The Supreme Court made it clear in Buckley v. Vallejo that avoiding the appearance of corruption is as important as avoiding actual corruption. If an honest system is perceived as corrupt, we still have a problem.
I thought you hated Buckley v. Vallejo.
I do. However, I'm trying to bring Lessig's argument down to the level of authorities you misguidedly hold in esteem.
Even if you don't find them credible?
I don't find the Bible credible, but I will quote it if I need to convince an evangelical Christian that homosexuality is no more sinful than pride.
Fair enough. I concede the point that the abandonment of the public option can, though it need not, cause an appearance of corruption.
And remember, this is only one example. The book also includes examples relating to high fructose corn syrup, cell phones, pollution, copyright, financial regulation, and, of course, the tax code, the complexity of which is specifically designed to force special interests to provide campaign cash to politicians so that the politicians will continue to renew special provisions in the tax code to the benefit of those interests.
Are you going to make me listen to the banal details of each of these examples until, 2 days from now, my wife needs to file a missing persons report?
Thankfully, no. The results of all these examples, and many more, have been summarized by Martin Gilens. He found that the government does not respond to the preferences of the public, defined as the 50th income percentile and below, but does respond to the preferences of the rich, defined as the 90th income percentile and above. As you can see in the chart, the predicted probability that the government enacts a change is completely insensitive to the preferences of the public, while being reasonably sensitive to the preferences of the rich. Let me say that again. The government is wholly indifferent to the preferences of those below the 50th income percentile, and yet is reasonably responsive to the preferences of those above the 90th income percentile.
Given the well-known correlation between education and income, that graph is probably the result of the largely random preferences of the uneducated public and the more reasonable preferences of the educated elite.
Being a professional political scientist, Gilens was aware of and controlled for education differences. The result doesn't change. Anyway, I know you're intellectually creative enough to contrive benign explanations when necessary, but doesn't it feel like you're trying to chop down lone trees while the forest continues to grow all around you?
Perhaps, but if I'm ignoring the forest, you're ignoring the air. You're claiming that politicians are so desperate for money that they abnegate their responsibility to the public, yet study after study shows there is no causal relationship between spending money and winning elections.
Well, yes, most studies do show that. But most studies don't use Thomas Ferguson's spatial latent variable instrumental variable model.
I'm not certain the English language allows you to put those words in that order.
I'm bringing up Ferguson's result to point out that two credible academics can use two different methodologies to arrive at different conclusions. When we need to choose which conclusion to believe, we are forced to ask ourselves, which result best comports with information which couldn't be included in either methodology? Social scientists like working with prediction markets because they believe people will make better choices when their money is at stake. Well, the money of campaign contributors is definitely at stake. Do you really think they would contribute if it didn't produce results?
I understand your point, but it's hardly a positive argument in favor of your conclusion.
You're like a chess player fixated on the kings when you really need to look at the whole board. The people to whom these decisions matter most continue to raise, give, and spend money at record rates every election cycle. Gilens showed that the government responds to the policy preferences of the wealthy, but not the general public. Ferguson showed the causal link between spending money and winning elections. And I still haven't mentioned that the best way to grow a business is to lobby the government. From 2002 to 2013, the stock prices of the 50 companies which spent the most on lobbying had an average annual increase of 17.4%, compared to only 6% for the S&P 500. Plus, the Sunlight Foundation has shown that lobbying between 2007 and 2012 yielded an average 76,000% return on investment. Is the forest dense enough to pique your claustrophobia yet?
I finally see the connection to Hayek. Regardless, writing for the majority in Citizens United v. FEC, Justice Kennedy explained, the fact that a corporation, or any other speaker, is willing to spend money to try to persuade voters presupposes that the people have the ultimate influence over elected officials.
Wow.
I'm sorry, is representative democracy funny to you?
It's funny that not even 5 minutes ago you were arguing that the public was so stupid that its opinions were random, and now you're trying to argue that the random actors therein have the ultimate influence over elected officials? I think it might be time for you to give your wife a call. Once she knows you're safe and sound, we can have a nice long talk about exactly how informed, or not, the public is.
I look forward to it.